My name is Luke Hendricks. In 2012, I was 34 years old and working as a park ranger at Green Hollow National Forest, a vast, isolated stretch of wilderness in northern Montana. The forest spanned miles of dense trees, winding trails, and unmarked terrain. I'd been stationed at Green Hollow for 6 years. Most days, I loved the quiet. I liked the solitude of patrolling the trails, the scent of pine in the air, and the feeling of being entirely removed from the chaos of the modern world. The ranger station was my base of operations, a sturdy log cabin built decades ago when the park first opened. It sat about 5 miles off the nearest paved road, deep in the forest. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and only a crackling radio to connect me to the outside world. I didn't mind. I preferred it that way. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I took it seriously. My duties ranged from routine trail inspections to wildlife monitoring and occasional search and rescue missions. Most of the time, things were uneventful. The forest didn't get many visitors, especially in the off-season, which is why I was surprised when everything started that November. It was a Monday afternoon, cold but clear. The off-season had already set in, so the trails were mostly deserted. I was scheduled to do a routine check of Trail 14, a remote path that wound through the heart of the forest. I drove my old park truck as far as the dirt road would allow, then hiked the rest of the way to the trailhead. Trail 14 was rarely used. It was narrow and overgrown in spots, with uneven terrain and a few steep drops. It was also the most beautiful trail in the park, cutting through dense fir trees and offering occasional views of the rocky cliffs above. About 2 miles in, I noticed something strange. There was a campsite just off the trail. That wasn't unusual in itself. Campers occasionally wandered off the marked paths, but this one felt off. The tent was collapsed, its fabric torn in several places. Scattered around the site were a few personal items: a backpack, a pair of boots, a flashlight. But what stood out the most was the silence. Normally, you'd hear birds, rustling leaves, or even the occasional squirrel. But here it was dead quiet. I radioed the station to report the campsite, but the signal was weak. All I got was static. I figured I'd inspect the site, then hike back to report in person. As I approached the tent, I saw drag marks in the dirt, leading into the trees. They weren't deep, but they were clear enough to follow. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to investigate further. Finally, I decided to mark the location with GPS and head back to the cabin. Something about the site made my stomach churn, and I didn't want to push my luck. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was setting. The woods always felt different at night. Shadows stretched long, and every creak of a tree branch sounded sharper, more deliberate. I locked the cabin door behind me and set my gear down. The cabin wasn't much. A single room with a small kitchen, a cot, a wood stove, and a desk where I kept maps and reports. There was a small storage closet where I kept extra supplies and an emergency rifle mounted on the wall above the door. I brewed some coffee and sat down at the desk to document what I'd seen on Trail 14. As I wrote, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything I could explain. Just that sense you get when you know someone's watching you. I glanced out the window, but all I saw was darkness. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I checked the locks on the door and windows, then crawled into my cot. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those drag marks in the dirt. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside the cabin. It was faint, like twigs snapping underfoot. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. For a few minutes, I just listened, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. Then it came again, closer this time. I got out of bed, grabbed the rifle from the wall, and moved to the window. Shining the flashlight outside, I scanned the trees but saw nothing. just darkness and the faint outline of the forest. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, but deep down I didn't believe it. I locked the rifle and flashlight on the table and forced myself back to bed. The next morning, I went outside to check for signs of whatever had been there. First, I didn't see anything, but a few feet from the cabin, I found tracks in the mud. They were human, barefoot by the looks of them, and they circled the cabin several times. My stomach dropped. I radioed the station to report the tracks and the strange campsite on Trail 14. This time, I got through. I told my supervisor everything, but he didn't seem too concerned. Probably some transient, he said. Check the area again, and we'll follow up if anything turns up. I wasn't satisfied with that answer, but I didn't have a choice. I spent the rest of the day patrolling the area near the cabin, looking for more tracks or signs of movement. By evening, I hadn't found anything. That night, it happened again. This time, the noises were louder, closer. Twigs snapping, something brushing against the cabin walls. I sat in bed with the rifle across my lap, staring at the door. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, slow and steady, just outside the window. When morning finally came, I went outside and found more tracks. They were clearer this time, leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin door. Whoever or whatever had been out there was getting bolder. I decided to stay up the next night and keep watch. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat by the window with the rifle. Hours passed in silence. Then, just after 3 a.m., I saw movement in the trees. A figure, tall and thin with long arms, stepped out of the shadows. It stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin. Then it started walking toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I aimed the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The figure froze, then turned and ran back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed my things and left the cabin. I drove straight to the station and demanded that someone check Trail 14 and the area around my cabin. A search team was sent out, but they didn't find anything. No tracks, no campsite, nothing. I quit my job the next week. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that figure standing in the trees, watching, waiting, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for its next visitor. I still remember the day my friend Mark invited me to his grandma's old cabin in the woods. It was late summer, the kind of time when the days are long, but the air starts to carry a chill in the evenings. We were both in our mid-20s, trying to find ways to escape the grind of work and the monotony of city life. Mark had always talked about this cabin like it was some forgotten relic of his childhood, tucked away in the dense forests of upstate New York. He said it had been in his family for decades, but no one had stayed there in years. Mark sold it as an adventure, a weekend getaway to unplug and relax. I agreed because I needed the break. The cabin sounded charming in an old-fashioned way, and I was curious to see it. We left on a Friday morning, driving hours out of the city. The highway gave way to narrow country roads, and eventually, those turned into dirt paths barely wide enough for Mark's beat-up truck. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by towering pines. It was small and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. A rusty metal roof glinted faintly in the evening light. It was exactly what I'd pictured when Mark first described it. Quaint but undeniably eerie. Mark parked the truck and we unloaded our gear. As I stepped out, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No hum of traffic, no distant voices, not even the chirp of crickets. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt like the world had been muted. Inside, the cabin was even smaller than it looked. The main room had a fireplace, an old sofa, and a tiny kitchen in the corner. There were 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom, but everything smelled musty, like damp wood and forgotten memories. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the air was thick with dust. Mark laughed as he pulled off one of the sheets, revealing a worn armchair. "Cozy, huh?" he said, grinning. I forced a smile and nodded, though something about the place put me on edge. We spent the first hour cleaning up. Mark opened the windows to let in some fresh air while I swept the floors. By the time we were done, it was almost dark. We lit a few old oil lamps we found in a cabinet, giving the cabin a warm, flickering glow. That first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner on a portable camping stove Mark had brought and talked about nothing in particular. By the time we went to bed, I was feeling more at ease. The cabin might have been old and a little creepy, but it seemed harmless enough. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was faint, like someone walking slowly through the grass. I told myself it was probably Mark, but when I looked out the window, I didn't see him. When I stepped into the main room, Mark was already there, drinking coffee. He looked up and said he hadn't been outside yet. I didn't mention the footsteps. It was probably just an animal, I thought. After breakfast, we decided to explore the surrounding woods. The forest was dense, with narrow trails that twisted and turned in every direction. Mark led the way, pointing out spots he remembered from his childhood. An old treehouse, a creek where he used to fish. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind us. Of course, there was nothing there. At one point, we stumbled upon a clearing with the remains of an old barn. The wood was rotting, and the roof had caved in, but it was clear that someone had once used it. Mark said it had been abandoned long before his family bought the cabin. We poked around for a while, finding nothing but broken tools and rusted metal scraps. Still, the place gave me an uneasy feeling. Felt too quiet, too forgotten. That night, things took a turn. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the main room. My heart raced as I lay there, listening. I heard it again. A dull, heavy sound, followed by what I could only describe as shuffling. It was coming from the main room. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought and stepped out of the bedroom. The main room was empty, but one of the oil lamps had been knocked over. It lay on the floor, unbroken but rolling slightly as if it had just been dropped. I called out for Mark, but he didn't answer. His bedroom door was open, and when I peeked inside, he was sound asleep. The next morning, I told Mark what had happened. He shrugged it off, saying the cabin was old and probably settling. I didn't argue, but deep down, I didn't believe that. As the day went on, more strange things happened. We found the front door wide open, even though we were sure we'd locked it. The small stack of firewood we'd gathered the day before had been scattered across the yard. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I told Mark we should cut the trip short, but he insisted we stay. He said I was overreacting, that the cabin was just playing tricks on me. That last night was the worst. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of Mark yelling. I rushed into the main room and found him standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just pointed. I followed his gaze and saw what he was looking at. In the distance, near the tree line, there was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dark, but it was tall and motionless, standing just at the edge of the woods. We watched it for what felt like hours, but it never moved. Eventually, Mark pulled the curtains closed and said we should go back to bed. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside. I was sure that if I closed my eyes, I'd wake up to find that figure standing in the room. When morning finally came, we packed up and left without a word. Neither of us mentioned what we'd seen, but I knew we were both thinking about it. It's been years since that weekend, but I still think about the cabin. I think about the strange noises, the open door, the scattered firewood, and most of all, I think about the figure in the woods. Mark and I haven't spoken about it since, but sometimes I wonder if he's haunted by it, too. Whatever it was, whoever it was, I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back to that cabin again. It was late October, the kind of night where the rain comes down in thick sheets, the wind howls through the trees, and the cold seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I was 31 and had rented a small cabin deep in the woods of Vermont. The idea was to escape the city noise and focus on a project I had been procrastinating on for months: a detailed study of old forestry maps for a local history book I was writing. The cabin was remote, but it was affordable, and I thought the solitude would help me focus. The drive out there had already been unnerving. The narrow dirt road leading to the cabin twisted through miles of dense forest, barely wide enough for my car. By the time I arrived, the rain had started, and darkness was closing in. The cabin itself was a simple structure: one floor, a small kitchen, a living room with a wood stove, a single bedroom, and a tiny bathroom. There was no Wi-Fi, and cell service was spotty at best. I told myself it was part of the charm, but a small part of me was already uneasy about being so cut off from the world. By the time I unpacked my things and got a fire going in the wood stove, it was completely dark outside. The rain hammered against the roof, and the wind rattled the windows in their frames. I settled into the old, lumpy couch with my laptop and started going over some of the maps. The fire crackled in the stove, and for a while, I felt at ease, wrapped in the warmth and the glow of the flames. Around 9 p.m., I decided to make some tea. The kitchen was lit by a single dim bulb, and the rain drummed loudly against the window above the sink. I remember looking out into the darkness, seeing nothing but my own reflection in the glass, and feeling a sudden chill. It wasn't just the cold, it was a sense that I was being watched. I shook it off and went back to the living room. An hour later, I heard it for the first time, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the rain or a branch knocking against the cabin, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I paused my work and listened carefully. Top, top, top. It was coming from the front door. My stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting anyone, and as far as I knew, no one even knew I was out here. The cabin was at least a mile from the nearest house, and that was through dense woods. I got up slowly and moved toward the door. The tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, staring at the heavy wooden door. My heart was pounding in my chest. I told myself it had to be the wind or some animal, but a part of me didn't believe that. Finally, I mustered the courage to look through the peephole. There was nothing there, just darkness and the rain-soaked porch. I double-checked the lock on the door and went back to the living room, but I couldn't concentrate. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. I turned the fire up, hoping the warmth would calm my nerves, and tried to convince myself that I was being irrational. Then, just after midnight, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into total darkness. The only light came from the fire, which now seemed far too small and fragile. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen drawer and turned it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The rain outside seemed louder now, the wind more insistent. I tried not to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I decided to check the cabin's small generator. It was housed in a shed about 20 feet from the back door. I put on my jacket and boots, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The rain was icy, and the wind nearly tore the door from my hands as I opened it. I hurried to the shed, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly across the wet ground. The generator was fine, full of fuel and in working order. The power outage wasn't from my end. That meant it was the local grid, which made sense given the storm. Still, being out there in the dark, with the rain pouring down and the forest looming all around, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I hurried back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. I tried to go to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the dark, listening to the storm, every noise amplified by my imagination. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was coming from the window in the bedroom. I froze. The sound was soft but deliberate.
Top, top, top.
It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a branch. Someone or something was tapping on the glass. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped. I waited, straining to hear any other sounds, but there was nothing. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek out from under the covers. The window was just a few feet from the bed. I could see it clearly in the faint glow of the firelight from the other room. There was nothing there, no shadow, no movement. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe a bird or some other animal. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon, and jumping at every sound. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the forest was eerily quiet. I decided I couldn't stay there another night. I packed up my things and loaded the car, but as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. There, on the front porch, were muddy footprints, bare human footprints, leading up to the door and then away into the woods. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is that they knew I was there, and they wanted me to know they were watching. It was the winter of 2012, and I had just turned 29. Life had been chaotic, so when my coworker, Dave, mentioned his family's cabin deep in the woods of Colorado, I jumped at the chance for a little solitude. Dave told me the cabin was basic, no Wi-Fi, no electricity, just a wood stove and lanterns. But that was exactly what I needed. I packed light, food, a sleeping bag, a few books, and my camera. It was going to be a weekend of peace and quiet. I drove up late on a Friday. The cabin was tucked away off a narrow, snow-covered road, about 5 miles from the nearest small town. I remember how eerie it felt driving there. The snowstorm had started earlier than forecasted, and my truck's headlights barely cut through the swirling snowflakes. The road was slippery, and the forest on either side looked like a wall of shadows. I hadn't passed another car for at least 20 minutes when I finally spotted the turnoff for the cabin. A wooden sign, barely visible under the snow, marked the entrance. The driveway was unplowed, so I parked at the end and hiked the last quarter mile with my gear. The wind was sharp, cutting through my coat, and by the time I reached the cabin, I was chilled to the bone. The place was smaller than I expected, just a single room with a loft for sleeping, but it looked sturdy. Snow was already piling up against the windowsills. Inside, it was colder than I imagined. The wood stove was in the corner, and the previous visitor had left a neat pile of firewood. I wasted no time lighting a fire, and soon, the room started to warm up. There was a small table, 2 chairs, and a creaky cot on the ground floor. The loft had a thin mattress and a pile of blankets, but I decided to sleep downstairs where it was warmer. After a quick dinner of canned soup, I settled into a chair by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside. The cabin creaked occasionally as the wind pushed against it, but otherwise, it was silent. I felt completely isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. I woke up early the next morning to a thick blanket of snow outside. The storm had dumped at least 2 feet overnight, and the sky was still heavy with clouds. I wasn't worried. I had enough food for 3 days, and the storm was supposed to clear by Sunday. I spent the morning reading and occasionally stepping outside to snap photos of the forest. The silence was surreal. No birds, no animals, just the crunch of snow under my boots and the distant roar of the wind through the trees. By midday, the storm had picked up again. I decided to stay inside and focus on keeping the fire going. That's when I noticed something strange. The snow outside was untouched, yet there were faint marks on the window lines that looked like scratches. I brushed it off, thinking it was just tree branches swaying in the wind, but the trees weren't that close to the cabin. I tried not to think about it. As the afternoon wore on, the storm grew worse. The wind was so strong now that it sounded like a freight train passing by. I checked my phone, but there was no service, not even a single bar. I wasn't surprised. Dave had warned me about that. I turned it off to conserve the battery. When night fell, the cabin felt much smaller. The wind outside was relentless, and the firelight flickered against the walls. I tried reading again but couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to those scratches on the window. They didn't look natural, and they definitely weren't there the night before. I told myself it didn't matter, but I felt uneasy. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the cabin. It was a steady, deliberate crunch, like footsteps in the snow. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window, but all I could see was the blinding white of the snowstorm. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The footsteps had been too heavy. I locked the door and pushed the table in front of it, just in case. Felt ridiculous, but it gave me some peace of mind. The next morning, the storm had stopped. The world outside was bright and blindingly white, but the uneasy feeling from the night before hadn't gone away. I stepped outside to look around, and that's when I saw the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were human footprints, leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin. I followed them as far as I could, but after about 50 feet, they disappeared into the trees. It didn't make any sense. Who would be out here in the middle of a storm? And why would they come to the cabin and leave without knocking or trying to get inside? I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert. Every noise made me jump, and I kept checking the windows for movement. As night fell, I decided to stay awake and keep the fire going. The idea of sleeping felt impossible. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were right outside the cabin. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and shined it at the window. The light reflected off the glass, but I couldn't see anything beyond the beam. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then, I heard the faint sound of scratching like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the door. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was out there knew I was inside. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, the scratching stopped, and the footsteps faded into the distance. I stayed up until dawn, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and left. The drive back to town was nerve-wracking. The road was barely passable, and I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I never told Dave what happened. I didn't want him to think I was crazy, but I've thought about it every winter since. Those footprints, the scratches on the window, the deliberate way the footsteps circled the cabin. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there and they wanted me to know it. Now, every time the snow falls, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. hadn't been back to the cabin in years. After my divorce, I had no reason to return. My ex-husband, Paul, got it in the settlement. It wasn't like I was bitter about it. I'd never liked the place. Too remote, too quiet, and way too many memories tied to a marriage that had fallen apart. Still, when he called out of the blue asking for help, something in his voice made me agree. Paul never asked for anything. Even during our divorce, he had been stubbornly self-sufficient, refusing to share the emotional weight of what we were going through. But on that call, he sounded off. He told me he had been staying at the cabin full-time for a few months, working on repairs. He didn't go into detail about what was wrong, but he asked if I could come by to help him sort some things out. Against my better judgment, I said yes. It was late October when I drove up. The trees lining the mountain road were bare, their skeletal branches scratching at the sky. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones if you stand still for too long. I pulled up to the cabin just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. The porch sagged under its own weight, the paint on the shutters was peeling, and the windows were streaked with grime. Paul's truck was parked out front, but there was no sign of him. I stepped out of my car and immediately noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint whistle of the wind. The silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The door was unlocked, so I let myself in. The inside of the cabin was a mess. Furniture was pushed against the walls. The floor was littered with tools and scraps of wood, and the air smelled damp, like mold and rotting wood. "Paul?" I called out, but the cabin swallowed the sound. I walked through the main room, stepping over scattered nails and bits of insulation. The kitchen was just as bad. Dishes piled in the sink, food wrappers on the counter. It looked like he hadn't cleaned in weeks. I found a note on the table, written in Paul's handwriting. "Gone to check the traps. Back soon. Stay inside." I frowned. Traps? Paul had never been much of a hunter. Maybe he was trying to keep rodents out of the cabin. I decided to wait, figuring he wouldn't be gone long. Hours passed and he didn't come back. I tried calling his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. The cabin felt colder, darker. I lit a fire in the wood stove, but it barely seemed to make a dent in the chill. By midnight, I was worried. I thought about leaving, but something kept me there. A sense of obligation, maybe, or curiosity. I decided to take a flashlight and go look for him. The forest was dense and unforgiving. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but the trees pressed in from all sides. I followed a narrow trail leading away from the cabin, the ground uneven beneath my boots. I found the first trap about half a mile in. It was an old-fashioned steel jaw trap, the kind you see in movies. Blood stained the metal, but whatever had been caught was gone. Nearby, the ground was churned up, like there had been a struggle. As I stood there, I became aware of a noise in the distance. A low, rhythmic thumping. I couldn't tell what it was or where it was coming from, but it made my stomach turn. I thought about turning back, but I pressed on, following the sound. The second trap was worse. It was still set, but the ground around it was littered with animal bones. Fresh ones. The thumping noise grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the forest floor. I came to a clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing was a large pit, about 10 feet wide and just as deep. Wooden stakes lined the bottom, their tips dark with something that looked like blood. And then I saw Paul. He was on the other side of the clearing, dragging something heavy. A tarp wrapped around a shape I couldn't make out. He was moving slowly, methodically, like he had done this before. I stepped back, but a twig snapped under my boot. Paul's head jerked up, and his eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he dropped the tarp and started toward me. I ran. The forest was a blur as I sprinted back toward the cabin. I could hear Paul behind me, his heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. I made it back to the cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I grabbed my car keys from the table and ran to the back door, hoping to slip out and make it to my car. But Paul was already there. He stood in the driveway, illuminated by the moonlight. His hands were empty, but the look in his eyes was enough to freeze me in place. I backed into the cabin and locked the back door, then ran upstairs to the bedroom. There was an old rifle in the closet. I remembered Paul showing it to me years ago. I grabbed it and loaded it with shaking hands, then sat in the corner, waiting. Hours passed. The sun started to rise, and the light filtered through the grimy windows. I thought maybe he had given up, but then I heard the front door creak open. I held my breath as footsteps echoed through the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. I gripped the rifle tighter, my finger on the trigger. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. The doorknob turned, and the door swung open. It wasn't Paul. It was a man I didn't recognize, holding a knife. I fired. The man fell, the knife clattering to the floor. My ears rang from the gunshot, but I didn't have time to think. I ran past him and out of the cabin, straight to my car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they hurt. I called the police from a gas station, but when they went to the cabin, they found nothing. No body, no traps, no pit in the woods. Just an empty cabin, falling apart in the middle of nowhere. Paul was never found, and I'll never know who that man was or why he was there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that same rhythmic thumping in my dreams, and I wonder if Paul is still out there, dragging something heavy through the woods. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 32 at the time, going through a rough patch in life. My job was demanding, and my personal life was crumbling under the weight of long, unspoken issues. I needed to get away from everything: emails, phone calls, city noise, and the constant reminders of responsibilities. A week in isolation sounded like the perfect escape. I found the cabin listing online. It wasn't luxurious or modern. It was old and simple, built decades ago by some hunter who must have liked his solitude. The ad described it as peaceful, remote, and surrounded by untouched wilderness. That's all I needed to hear. The photos showed a sturdy wooden structure, a fireplace, and a small dock extending into a quiet lake. It was perfect. The drive took about 6 hours. The closer I got to the cabin, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. The paved roads turned into gravel, and eventually the GPS lost signal entirely. I had printed out directions beforehand, knowing this might happen. The final stretch of the journey was a narrow dirt path surrounded by dense trees, their branches arching overhead to form a tunnel of green. It was beautiful but eerie at the same time. The sun was starting to set, and the fading light made the shadows between the trees look darker and deeper. When I finally arrived, I felt a wave of relief. The cabin was exactly as it had looked in the photos. A small, weathered structure with a sloping roof and a porch that faced the lake. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under my weight, and the sound echoed faintly in the quiet. Inside, the cabin was basic but cozy. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom with a worn-out bed. The place smelled faintly of wood smoke and age. I unpacked my things, lit a fire, and made myself a simple dinner. As I ate, I looked out the window at the lake. The water was still, reflecting the orange and purple hues of the sunset. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up early the next morning, eager to explore. There were trails around the cabin that led deeper into the forest. I spent hours walking, taking in the sights and sounds of nature. Birds chirped high above, and the occasional rustle of leaves signaled the presence of small animals. The forest felt alive, but it also felt isolated, like a world entirely separate from the one I had left behind. By the time I returned to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I was tired but satisfied. I made dinner, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. It was around midnight when I woke up to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it sounded too deliberate, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, a soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't fade. It seemed to circle the cabin, slow and deliberate. I got out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin, but I didn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and went back to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I brushed off the incident as my imagination playing tricks on me. I spent the day fishing at the lake, trying to focus on the peace and quiet, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more distinct. I was sure it wasn't an animal. The deliberate pace, the weight of the steps, it felt human. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat by the window, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to appear. But nothing did. The footsteps eventually stopped, and silence returned. But the unease didn't leave me. By the third day, I was on edge. I considered leaving, but the thought of driving through the forest at night scared me even more. I spent most of the day close to the cabin, keeping an eye on the tree line. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. That night, the noises escalated. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. I heard tapping on the windows, soft but deliberate. Then there was a sound like something being dragged across the porch. My heart pounded as I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a fire poker. I moved from window to window, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but all I saw was darkness. At one point, the sound stopped completely. The silence was deafening. I stood in the middle of the cabin, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the next sound. Then, suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. I froze. It wasn't a knock. It was a heavy, forceful impact, like someone trying to break it down. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. The banging continued, each hit sending a jolt of fear through me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found marks on the door, deep scratches and dents that hadn't been there before. It confirmed what I had been dreading. Someone had been outside the cabin. I decided to leave immediately. I packed my things in record time and threw them into the car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The drive back to civilization felt like it took forever. When I finally reached a small town, I stopped at a gas station to fill up. The attendant gave me a curious look and asked if I was okay. I must have looked as shaken as I felt. I didn't say much, just paid for the gas and left. It's been years since that trip, but I still think about it. I don't know who or what was outside that cabin, and I don't want to know. What scares me the most is the thought that whoever it was might still be out there, waiting for the next person to stumble into their woods. I haven't gone back to the wilderness since, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are better left alone. I wasn't looking for solitude, but that's what I found. It was late November, 2019, and I'd been looking for a quiet spot to finish some freelance work that had been piling up. A friend of mine mentioned his uncle had a cabin in northern Michigan, tucked deep in the woods near a place called Huron Lake. It wasn't fancy, but it had power, running water, and decent Wi-Fi. The perfect place to work uninterrupted. The cabin was about an hour's drive from the nearest town, down a series of dirt roads that became more like trails the further I went. By the time I reached the place, it was well after sunset, and the only light came from my car's headlights. The cabin was small and dark, its outline barely visible through the trees. There were no neighbors, no streetlights, and no cell service. Just an old cabin in the woods, surrounded by miles of forest. Inside, it was rustic but cozy. A single room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a small bathroom. There was a wood stove for heat, a rickety table for eating or working, and shelves stocked with non-perishable food. A single window overlooked the front porch, and another smaller one faced the forest out back. I set my bags down, turned on the lights, and locked the door behind me. The silence was immediate and heavy, broken only by the creak of the floorboards as I moved around. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I spent my mornings working, afternoons hiking the trails that wove through the forest, and evenings reading or watching downloaded shows on my laptop. The isolation was refreshing at first, a welcome break from the constant noise of the city. The only strange thing was the occasional sound at night, branches snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. After all, I was deep in their territory. On the third night, the noises got louder. Around midnight, I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart started pounding, and I sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was nothing. Then came a faint tapping on the front door. It was so light it could have been the wind, but it didn't feel random. It was too deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. Peering through the curtains, I could see nothing but darkness. The porch was empty. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder than it should. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. Barefoot from the looks of it. The prints led from the forest to the porch and then back into the trees. A cold wave of unease washed over me. Who would be walking around out here barefoot in late November? I didn't want to stick around to find out, so I packed my bags and decided to leave. But when I tried starting my car, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. I wasn't completely stranded. The cabin had a landline phone for emergencies, so I tried calling for help. But the line was dead, too. I considered walking to the nearest town, but it was a 2-hour drive, which meant a full day's hike through unfamiliar woods. It was already past noon, and I didn't want to risk getting caught out after dark. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping busy with small tasks to distract myself. I chopped wood for the stove, reorganized the shelves, cleaned the cabin. Anything to keep my mind off the strange tracks. But as night fell, the unease returned. The woods outside seemed darker than before, the silence heavier. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows and kept a flashlight and a knife within arm's reach. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was shuffling, scratching at the walls, and faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. My heart raced as I sat in the dark, clutching the knife, every muscle in my body tense. The sounds circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other. Whoever or whatever it was, they were toying with me. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the back window, followed by a high-pitched scream that cut through the night. I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but the window was intact. I could see movement just beyond the glass, shadows darting between the trees. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. For hours, the torment continued. The whispers grew louder, the banging more forceful. At one point, something slammed against the front door so hard I thought it would burst open. I held my ground, knife in hand, flashlight shaking. When dawn finally broke, the noises stopped. The forest fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. I barely slept that night, and by morning I was done. I packed my things and started walking. I didn't care how far the town was. I just needed to get out of there. The woods were eerily quiet as I trudged through the undergrowth, every snap of a twig making me jump. After what felt like hours, I reached the dirt road that led back to civilization. Relief washed over me as I saw a truck coming up the road. The driver was a middle-aged man who worked for the local power company. He said he'd been sent to check on the cabin after a neighbor reported strange activity. When I told him what had happened, he frowned and said the landline had likely been cut. It was a common issue with wildlife. But the tracks, the banging, the whispers, he had no explanation. I never found out who or what had been outside that cabin. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I looked back one last time, I thought I saw something move in the shadows of the trees. I turned away quickly and kept walking, the memory of that place etched in my mind forever. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back.